You know, we spend a lot of time thinking about the great Viking achievements, the long ships that crossed oceans, the warriors who struck fear into medieval Europe, the explorers who reached North America 500 years before Columbus. But here's something that doesn't make it into the history books very often. How did these people not freeze to death? I mean, really think about it for a moment. We're talking about a civilization that thrived in one of the harshest climates on Earth, Western Norway in the 9th century after Christ. Winter temperatures that would make modern people with their high-tech gear think twice about stepping outside. And yet, Viking women, not warriors, not jarls, just ordinary women running farmsteads, had to survive 4 months of darkness and cold that could kill you if you made even small mistakes. Our story begins in 872. After Christ, in the frozen depths of a Norwegian winter, a woman named Astrid stands at the door of her farmstead, watching 3 figures disappear down a snow-covered path. Her husband and her 2 brothers are heading to the coast to join a winter raid. Now, winter raids were dangerous. The North Sea in January doesn't care how good a sailor you are, but they were also necessary. The family needs silver. The men need to maintain their status, their reputation. This is how Viking society works. Astrid is 26 winters old. She won't see those men again until spring. If she sees them again at all, the gods are not always kind, and the winter sea takes what it wants. But here's the thing that really gets me. While her husband is off raiding and possibly dying, Astrid faces a challenge that has killed countless women before her. She has to keep herself alive. She has to keep her 2 young children alive. She has to keep her 70-year-old grandmother alive for 4 months, in conditions that would make a modern winter camping trip look like a vacation. The farmstead sits in a valley where winter doesn't mess around. I'm talking about temperatures so low that if you spit, it freezes before it hits the ground. Winds sweep down from the mountains with enough force to literally knock a grown man off his feet. Frostbite waits for any exposed skin. Hypothermia is a constant threat. The difference between life and death often comes down to something as simple as staying warm while you work, and the work never stops. Every morning, Astrid has to milk 2 cows in a barn where her breath forms clouds in the air. She feeds a dozen sheep and 4 goats. That's the family's wealth right there, their insurance policy. She hauls water that has to be broken from ice. She splits firewood. She cooks meals of dried fish and barley porridge. She spins wool, weaves cloth, and somehow keeps 2 children alive through endless frozen days. Every single one of these tasks requires going outside into cold that bites exposed skin like wolves' teeth. Now, let's talk about what she's wearing, because this is where it gets interesting. Astrid wears what every Viking woman wears: a linen underdress next to her skin, then a long wool overdress dyed with madder root to a deep red colour, wool leg wrappings bound with leather strips, sturdy boots stuffed with dried grass for insulation, and a heavy wool cloak fastened with a bronze brooch. When she works outside, she adds more. Another cloak, a wool shawl wrapped around her head and neck, extra wrappings on her hands and feet. Here's the problem. This clothing is warm enough if you stay still. But movement? Movement becomes torture. The heavy wool absorbs moisture from her sweat and breath. It grows heavier throughout the day. By evening, her garments feel like they weigh twice what they did at dawn. And here's the killer, literally the killer that dampness conducts heat away from her body. She comes back inside, shivering despite wearing what must be 20 pounds of fabric. One evening, as Astrid struggles, out of her damp, heavy clothing, her grandmother speaks. Now, this grandmother is something else, 70 winters old and sharp as a new blade. She survived 3 husbands, 2 lost to the sea, 1 to a feuding neighbour's axe, and raised 6 children to adulthood. This is a woman who knows things that other women have forgotten. Secrets passed from mother to daughter across generations that stretch back beyond memory. The old woman sits by the fire, spinning wool on a drop spindle, and without looking up, she says, "Your grandmother's grandmother knew something you have forgotten, child." Astrid stops. Water is dripping from her wool overdress onto the packed earth floor. What did she know? That the warmth you seek is not in the cloth. The drop spindle twirls, pulling wool into thread. The secret is not in the thickness, child, but in the trap. What trap? But her grandmother only smiles and continues spinning, the firelight dancing across her weathered face. She has said what she means to say. The rest Astrid must discover for herself. Now, I love this moment because it's so perfectly Viking. No long explanation, no step-by-step instructions, just a cryptic piece of wisdom and the expectation that if you're smart enough, you'll figure it out. And if you're not, well, the winter will take care of that. The next weeks pass in the rhythm of winter survival. The same tasks, day after day, but Astrid starts watching more carefully, particularly the birds. A raven lands on the fence post outside her farmstead one morning, and she notices something she's seen 1,000 times before but never really thought about. The bird fluffs its feathers until it appears twice its normal size. It has created a sphere of trapped air around itself. You can see it in how the feathers stand away from the body. And here's what really catches her attention. On the coldest days, the birds fluff most dramatically, creating the largest air gaps. On milder days, they press their feathers flat. The birds are not adding more feathers, they're changing the space between them. One night, unable to sleep, she lies there thinking about her grandmother's words. The secret is not in the thickness, but in the trap. What trap? She thinks of the raven's fluffed feathers. She thinks about her grandmother's thick wool blanket, which seems warmer than two thinner blankets laid flat against each other. But when those same two blankets are separated by just a finger's width of air, they become warmer than the single thick one, and then the understanding arrives, like dawn breaking over the mountains. Air itself is the insulator. The fabric merely holds the air in place. It's such a simple insight, but simple insights can change everything. Because what Astrid has just figured out lying there in the darkness of a Norwegian winter in 872, after Christ, is a principle that will eventually enable Vikings to settle Iceland and Greenland, that will keep Varangian guards comfortable from Constantinople to Kiev, that will survive 1,000 years to become the foundation of every modern cold-weather clothing system on Earth. But she doesn't know any of that yet. Right now, she just knows that tomorrow morning she's going to try something different. She's going to test whether this crazy idea about trapped air actually works. Because if it doesn't, she might freeze to death. But if it does, she might have just solved a problem that has killed people for as long as humans have lived in the frozen north. So, the next morning, Astrid decides to run an experiment. And I want you to appreciate how gutsy this is. She's essentially betting her life on an untested theory about air and fabric, in conditions where getting it wrong means hypothermia, where hypothermia means death. But this is what separates people who make breakthroughs from people who just accept the way things are. The willingness to test an idea, even when the stakes are high. Instead of her usual setup, linen underdress and heavy wool overdress, she tries something different. She puts on her linen underdress. Then she adds a thin wool tunic her grandmother made years ago. Then, her regular wool overdress. But here's the key. She wears it loosely. She's deliberately leaving space between the layers. She wraps a thin wool shawl around her shoulders beneath her cloak, creating another layer of trapped air. She walks out to the barn expecting to freeze, and instead, she feels warm. More than that, when she comes back inside after feeding the animals, her inner layers are still dry. The loose outer layers have allowed moisture to escape while the trapped air between the garments has held her body heat close. The discovery electrifies her. For the next month, she tests variations obsessively. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Astrid is essentially conducting scientific research 1,100 years before we'd have modern equipment to measure what she's measuring. She's using her own body as the laboratory, winter as the testing ground, and survival as the measure of success. She tries tight layers. They don't work as well because when the fabrics press together, you eliminate the air gaps. She tries too many layers, 4 or 5, and discovers she overheats even in bitter cold. She sweats so much that the moisture defeats the insulation. Through trial and error, she figures out that 3 layers work best. A light linen or thin wool layer next to the skin to move moisture away, a thicker wool middle layer to trap the largest volume of air, and a tightly woven outer layer to block wind and protect those precious air pockets beneath. Now, not all of these experiments go well. One afternoon, testing a configuration with layers that are too thin, she nearly dies. She's out checking on the sheep when a sudden storm rolls in, and if you've never experienced a Norwegian winter storm, imagine being hit by a wall of wind and snow that comes out of nowhere. The temperature drops, the wind picks up, and her experimental layers aren't quite right. She barely makes it back to the farmstead, stumbling through the door half frozen. Her grandmother doesn't say a word, just builds up the fire, wraps her in blankets, and gives her that look. You know the look, the one that says, "I told you there was something to learn, not something to die from." Astrid learns a crucial lesson that day. The outer layer has to be substantial enough to block wind, because wind is ruthless. Wind collapses those warm air pockets and steals your heat with brutal efficiency. By the time the legendary blizzard arrives, the storm that people in that valley still talk about generations later, Astrid has perfected her system. And let me paint you a picture of this blizzard, because it's the kind of storm that defines a winter. Snow piles up to the roofs, winds shriek like something out of nightmare. The temperature drops so low that the ale freezes solid in its barrels. Think about that for a second. Ale, frozen solid. Neighbours huddle in their longhouses wearing every single garment they own, barely leaving the warmth of their fires. Men are literally urinating in corners rather than face the journey to the outhouse. Children are crying with cold despite being wrapped in multiple cloaks. This storm traps the entire valley for 10 days. 10 days of siege warfare between humans and winter. And Astrid? She walks to the barn twice every day in her 3-layer system. Comfortable, mobile. She's wearing thin wool next to her skin, a medium-weight wool tunic with a loose weave in the middle, and a dense outer wool dress with a tightly woven cloak. The whole system weighs maybe half what her old heavy layers weighed, but it keeps her warmer, more importantly. And this is crucial for someone who has to work to survive. She can move. She can work. She stays dry. When the storm finally breaks and people emerge from their houses, they find Astrid outside splitting firewood, just going about her business, seemingly untouched by the 10-day siege of winter that has left everyone else exhausted and depleted. The valley erupts in speculation. Does she have magic? Is she blessed by the gods? Some people whisper darker things. Maybe she made a deal with forces that shouldn't be dealt with. Astrid says nothing. But her grandmother? Her grandmother just smiles at the fire and keeps spinning her wool. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that I find absolutely fascinating. Fast forward to the summer of 873. After Christ, June arrives, and it brings something unusual to the Norwegian fjord's heat. Not the cool, comfortable Norwegian summer that people are used to, but day after day of blazing sun, the kind of heat that turns a normally temperate climate into something you'd expect in southern Europe. Farmers are collapsing in the fields, work slows to a crawl. People retreat to shade during the hottest hours, because nobody in Norway knows how to handle this kind of sustained heat. And Astrid, preparing to help with the hay harvest, has a thought. If trapped air insulates against cold moving inward toward her body, might it also insulate against heat moving inward from outside? She experiments. The thin inner layer draws sweat away from her skin. The middle layer creates an air gap that shields her body from the external heat. The loose outer layer allows air to circulate while blocking direct sunlight. She adds a wide-brimmed straw hat and discovers something remarkable. While other women are struggling through the hay cutting, drenched in sweat and dizzy with heat exhaustion, Astrid is comfortable. Not just bearable, comfortable. She works longer hours than anyone else in the valley, maintaining a steady pace, while everyone else needs constant rest breaks. This is the moment when Astrid realizes she hasn't just invented a winter survival trick. She's discovered a principle, a fundamental truth about how bodies and air and fabric interact. The double mastery comfort in both winter cold and summer heat transforms her understanding completely. This isn't seasonal, this is universal. And from a historical perspective, this is huge. Because what limits human expansion? Climate. What determines where you can settle? How long you can campaign? How far you can trade? your ability to function in extreme temperatures. Astrid has just figured out how to hack that limitation using nothing but careful observation and existing materials. In late summer of 873 after Christ, something unusual happens. A delegation arrives at Astrid's farmstead. Now, farmsteads in this time and place don't usually get delegations unless something important is happening. And at the head of this group rides Ingrid, wife of Jarl Halvard, a man who controls 3 valleys and commands 40 warriors. Ingrid is known, throughout the Fjordlands, as someone who misses nothing, shrewd in trade, fierce in protecting her husband's interests, always seeking advantages that will elevate her family's status. She's heard the stories about Astrid's mysterious comfort during both the terrible winter blizzard and the brutal summer heat. And Ingrid understands something that a lot of people miss. Comfort is power. Warriors who stay warm without heavy gear fight better. Traders who can work through temperature extremes earn more. This isn't about making life pleasant. This is about competitive advantage. Show me, Ingrid demands. Not, hello, not, I've heard interesting things. Just, show me. Viking culture respected directness, so Astrid does. She explains the principle of trapped air. She demonstrates the 3-layer system. She describes how looseness and air gaps matter more than fabric weight, and Ingrid gets it immediately. You can see it in her eyes, the recognition that this knowledge is valuable, really valuable. Ingrid offers 10 ounces of hack silver for Astrid to come to the Jarl's Hall and teach the women there. Now, let me give you some context on this. 10 ounces of hack silver, literally silver chopped from arm rings and foreign coins, represents a fortune, more wealth than Astrid's farmstead generates in 2 years. This is serious money, but Astrid refuses. And this is where the story gets really interesting from a historical perspective, because her reasoning shapes how quickly this innovation spreads. She doesn't refuse because she doesn't want the silver. She refuses because she's figured out something perhaps more valuable. Knowledge that helps people survive should be shared freely. Not out of altruism necessarily, but out of strategic thinking. When your neighbours are stronger, when your community is more resilient, your own position becomes more secure. Ingrid stares at her for a long moment. Then she laughs, this sharp bark of surprise and respect. You are either a fool or wiser than my husband's skald, she says. Come to the autumn gathering. Teach there. I will make sure every woman of importance attends. The autumn gathering at the Jarl's Hall is one of those events that defined Viking social structure. People from 5 valleys, over 300 souls, gathering for 3 days of feasting, trading, settling disputes, arranging marriages, sharing news before winter locks everyone into their isolated farms. Normally, the women's work happens in the background, while men make speeches and negotiate and drink. This year is different. Astrid stands in the weaving room with 40 women crowded around her. Wealthy Jarl's wives in silk-trimmed dresses, thrall women in rough wool, young brides, grandmothers, all pressed together to learn, and she teaches. She uses her own clothing as demonstration. She explains the principle clearly. She answers every question. Some women grasp it immediately and start planning how to modify their existing garments. Others struggle with the concept. How can air, which weighs nothing, provide warmth? It seems counterintuitive. Astrid points to the smoke rising from the fire, trapped beneath the roof beams until it finds the smoke hole. Air can be held, she explains. Air can be shaped. Air can be used. The questions go long into the night. How many layers work best? Does linen or wool work better for the inner layer? How loose should the outer layer be? Should children use the same system? What about babies? Astrid answers everything. She shares her failures as freely as her successes. She describes nearly freezing during early experiments. She emphasizes the importance of that windproof outer layer. She explains that too many layers cause overheating and defeat the purpose. Within 2 months, the technique spreads through the entire region. By the winter solstice gathering, nearly every woman has modified her clothing approach. And here's what I love about this. Some women develop refinements Astrid never considered. Using 2 thin wool layers in the middle, instead of 1 thicker layer. adding detachable sleeves that can be put on or removed without changing the entire garment, creating specialized underlayers with tighter weave at the torso, but looser at the limbs for better movement. The innovation spawns more innovation, but the men adopt it more slowly. Pride gets in the way. Warriors mock it as woman's foolishness. Real men, they say, endure cold through strength of will, not clever clothing tricks. This attitude persists until a winter raid in 874. After Christ settles the argument in the most Viking way possible through superior performance in combat. One ship's crew uses the layering system, the others dress traditionally. They're all crossing the North Sea in January, which is about as unpleasant as seafaring gets. The layered crew arrives at their target, still warm, still ready to fight. The traditionally dressed crews arrive stiff with cold, exhausted from shivering through the crossing, barely able to grip their weapons effectively. The layered crew takes twice the plunder. Twice. Because they can fight while their companions are still trying to get their frozen muscles working. After that demonstration, resistance crumbles. Every warrior wants the advantage. Every trader realizes that comfort means longer working hours and more profit. Every sailor understands that hypothermia has killed more Norse seafarers than storms and combat combined. The layering principle spreads from western Norway to Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, and beyond. It travels the trade routes to Dublin, York, Kiev, Constantinople. Vikings who encounter it teach it to others, because the advantage is too obvious to keep secret. By 880 after Christ, less than a decade after Astrid's grandmother spoke her cryptic words by the fire, the three-layer principle has become standard knowledge throughout the Norse world. Astrid becomes something of a legend. Stories spread about the woman who trapped the wind, who taught people to wear air like armor. When she dies in 906, after Christ at the age of 60, her funeral draws people from three kingdoms. Not because she was wealthy, not because she was noble, but because she changed how humans survive in the north. Now, let's talk about what this innovation actually enabled. Because this isn't just a story about comfortable clothing. This is a story about how one insight opened up territories that would otherwise have been beyond human reach. When Norse settlers sailed to Iceland beginning in 874, after Christ, just 2 years after our story opened, they carried this knowledge with them. Iceland is brutal. Winters that make Norway look mild. Short summers that barely give crops time to grow. The old way of dressing heavy, single-layer clothing meant death. The settlers who thrived were the ones who understood trapped air and layered insulation. The ones who clung to tradition, they didn't survive long enough to pass on their genes or their stories. The settlement of Greenland in 982. After Christ pushed Vikings into even harsher conditions, Eric the Red and the families who followed him encountered an environment where winter temperatures regularly stayed well below freezing and summer barely climbed above it. Heavy wool cloaks and thick garments couldn't save you. That stuff absorbed moisture, froze solid, became dead weight that stole heat rather than preserving it. The Greenland Norse survived because they'd mastered the principle of layered air trap insulation. It allowed them to maintain body heat and mobility in conditions that would have killed their ancestors 2 centuries earlier. Here's another fascinating application. The Varangian Guard. Formed around 988 after Christ, these elite Norse warriors served Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. Think about their operational environment for a second. They're fighting in the frozen winters of the Balkans, then they're fighting in the scorching summers of Anatolia. Other soldiers struggled with heavy armor that became a furnace in Mediterranean heat, or an icebox in Russian winters. But the Varangians? They adapted by using layered systems beneath their mail. Thin linen in summer to wick sweat and create cooling air gaps. Thicker wool layers in winter to trap warmth. Their ability to fight effectively in any climate made them the most feared warriors in the Byzantine military for over 2 centuries. Leif Erikson's journey to North America around 1000. After Christ. Now. That's the ultimate test of Viking cold weather survival knowledge. Vinland's winter camps required clothing systems that could handle frigid North Atlantic crossings, followed by work in the forests of Newfoundland, where temperatures plunged and storms arrived without warning. The sagas mention nothing about revolutionary clothing. You know why? Because by this time, the layering principle was so fundamental to Norse culture that it didn't need special mention. It had become invisible, woven into how Vikings understood the relationship between body, air, and cloth. As the Viking Age ended and medieval Europe emerged, Astrid's specific story faded into legend and was eventually forgotten. But the knowledge persisted. It passed through practical communities who worked outdoors, fishermen in the North Sea, herders in the Scottish Highlands, hunters in the forests of Scandinavia and Russia. The principle survived because it worked, because failure to understand it meant death. Families that maintained the knowledge passed it to their children as essential survival wisdom. Communities that lost it suffered higher winter mortality rates, creating evolutionary pressure that preserved the insight even when the original source was forgotten. Then industrialization comes along in the 18th and 19th centuries and temporarily obscures this ancient wisdom. Factories start mass-producing heavy coats and thick garments. The marketing message is beautifully simple. More fabric equals more warmth. Millions of people buy heavy wool overcoats, thick military greatcoats, bulky winter clothing that repeats the exact same mistake Astrid solved 1,000 years earlier. Arctic explorers die of hypothermia, wearing the best heavy gear money can buy. Mountain climbers freeze on peaks, wearing multiple heavy layers. Soldiers in winter campaigns suffer terribly because their equipment emphasizes weight over intelligence. We actually forgot something that a 9th century Norwegian woman figured out by watching ravens. The rediscovery comes gradually through the 20th century. Polar explorers conducting systematic testing realize their heavy gear is killing them. It absorbs moisture. It loses insulation value. It creates exhaustion through sheer weight. Mountain climbers experimenting with different approaches find that multiple thin layers outperform single thick ones. Military researchers studying cold weather performance document that trapped air, not fabric mass, provides optimal insulation. By the mid-20th century, outdoor equipment companies start producing gear based explicitly on the layering principle. Light base layers for moisture management, insulating mid-layers to trap air, protective outer shells to block wind and precipitation. They're discovering, with all their modern materials, science and testing equipment, exactly what Astrid figured out through observation and experimentation. And modern science has validated every bit of her intuition. Still, air insulates approximately 25 times better than the same thickness of wool fiber. Multiple layers with air gaps between them create insulation values far exceeding their weight. Moisture management, keeping the layer next to skin dry, is critical for maintaining warmth. Wind protection matters enormously because moving air eliminates the warm air pockets that provide insulation. Every principle Astrid discovered in 872 after Christ has been proven correct by contemporary research. Today's advanced outdoor clothing uses materials she couldn't have imagined. Polyester base layers that wick moisture better than any natural fiber. Fleece mid-layers that maintain insulation even when wet. Gore-Tex shells that block wind and rain while allowing sweat to escape. But the fundamental architecture, the 3-layer system of wicking base, insulating middle, and protective outer, that's identical to what a Norwegian farmer's wife worked out by watching birds fluff their feathers on a fence post over 1,000 years ago. Mountaineers on Everest wear layering systems. Soldiers in Arctic deployments train in layering techniques. Antarctic researchers live in layered clothing for months at a time. Millions of skiers, hikers, hunters, and outdoor enthusiasts wear base layers, mid-layers, and shells without knowing they're using a system that enabled Vikings to settle Greenland and explore North America. The multi-billion-dollar outdoor clothing industry exists because one woman refused to freeze, watched carefully, listened to her grandmother's cryptic wisdom, and systematically tested ways to trap invisible air between fabrics. Astrid's name has been lost to history. No saga mentions her. No stone bears her rune-carved memorial. But her insight has survived a millennium, tested by countless people in the world's harshest environments, proven correct again and again. On every winter day, millions of people dress in layers, often without conscious thought, simply doing what works and carry forward a legacy that began beside a fire in a Norwegian farmstead, when an old woman smiled and spoke of secrets and traps. The greatest inventions are sometimes the quietest ones. They don't require new technology or rare materials. They just require someone willing to watch carefully, think clearly, and test systematically. Someone willing to see that the most powerful insulator has been invisible all along, the air itself, captured and held close by human ingenuity. And that, in the end, is what makes this story worth telling. Not because Astrid became famous, not because she got rich, but because she solved a fundamental problem of human survival using nothing but observation and intelligence. And because that solution, refined and improved but fundamentally unchanged, still keeps us warm 1,000 years later.